It's Tuesday, the 23rd of June, 1914, a special day in the history of the Salvation Army. 70,000 people have gathered here at the magnificent Crystal Palace for the climax of the Army's 4th International Congress, the Congress of Nations. There have already been nearly 2 weeks of packed meetings in the purpose-built Congress Hall on the Strand in London. But today is a day for people to enjoy themselves and celebrate being part of a truly international Salvation Army. There are 2,000 overseas delegates from 58 different countries, and they're cheered to the heavens as they march past in the Great Parade. Taking the salute is General Bramwell Booth. It was less than 2 years since William Booth, the Army's charismatic founder, had died. Less than 2 years for his son and successor Bramwell to make his own mark. So this day was very important for Bramwell Booth. It not only cemented his position as leader of this international army, but it showed to the world that far from dying along with its founder, the Salvation Army under its new leader was bigger and stronger than ever. That day at the Crystal Palace was also significant to a 20-year-old Cornishman named James Finn. He'd travelled up from Abertillery in South Wales with his troop of life-saving scouts, the Salvation Army's equivalent to the Boy Scouts. Like every scout troop attending, they'd been asked to put on some sort of a display. And since Abertillery was a mining town and James himself was a miner, his boys demonstrated how to rescue men from a burning pit. They did a good job. They pulled off the honours, James reported proudly. After that, they all lined up to be inspected by the General himself before joining the Grand Parade. So, all in all, a great day to be a Salvationist. And then within a week, everything changed. Just 5 days later, on Sunday, June the 28th, the Austrian Crown Prince was assassinated in Sarajevo, and Europe spiralled into chaos. Austria declared war on Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia and France and invaded Belgium, and on August the 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. James Finn must have been echoing the thoughts of every Salvationist who had been here at the Crystal Palace when he wrote, "If anyone had told me on that memorable day that I was soon to be at war with some of the countries then and there represented, I could not have believed it." General Shaw Clifton is an expert on the Salvation Army in wartime. I want to hear from him about the ideas that were guiding Bramwell Booth's thinking at this critical time.
He inherited these from his father, from the founder of the army, William Booth, who had experienced the first occasion of Salvationists being on opposing sides in a war situation when the Boer War broke out in 1899 and ran through to 1902. And William Booth established 3 fundamental principles. First of all, get the fighting men saved, evangelism, soul saving. If they're put into harm's way and about to die, work for their soul salvation. As simple as that. Get in amongst them, get into the camps, go to the battlefront with them. Go wherever the troops go. Secondly, compassionate action, not only for the troops, but for the families left at home, the war widows that were now multiplying in number. But then he established a third principle, and Bramwell, his son, in 1914, picked this up and ran with it again. We, the Salvation Army, will never pronounce upon the rights or wrongs of the war. We are politically neutral.
So what was the Salvation Army's view with regard to Salvationists who wanted to either volunteer or join the armed forces?
Some leading officers around Bramwell Booth urged the Booths to instruct Salvationists not to fight. And the Booths said, I can't find that in the scriptures, so I'm not going to do that. Then on the other side of it, there were those who were highly patriotic and said to the Booths, you should tell Salvationists to volunteer and come to their country's aid in the hour of their country's need. And the Booths said, I can't find that in scripture either, so I'm not going to say that. So this principle of freedom of individual conscience was established.
But there wasn't any anguished heart-searching for James Finn, the life-saving scout from Abertillery. Like hundreds of thousands of other young men, he volunteered within days of war being declared. James joined his local regiment, the South Wales Borderers, but it seems that the clerk wrote his name down wrong. Instead of spelling Finn F-I-N-N, he wrote it with a Y. And as far as the army was concerned, that was it. He was Finn with a Y for the rest of his army career. I've come to Bodmin, James's hometown, to meet John Stanyard, who studied James's story. He seems to have been everything Bramwell Booth could have hoped for.
When they were on board ship going over to Mesopotamia in 1915, he talks about the fact that they had 3 open-air services on board ship. He reckons that there were 8 other Salvationists on board ship with him. And during that particular day, they won 9 men for the Lord. 9 men got saved.
And compassion was also important. There are some lovely anecdotes of how he served his fellow men in the army camps.
Yes, like men would come to him and ask him, would you cut my hair for me? Or I've got a sore, I've got a cut, can you address it for me? Bearing in mind his first aiding experience. And he was more than happy to do that sort of work for them.
But that wasn't his regular job, was it?
Not at all. He was a fighting soldier, like the rest of his comrades. But they would ask him, out of his compassion, to help them. And that's what he enjoyed doing. If you look at his letters that he wrote home, one of the letters says that he was proud to be serving his country and the empire that the country belonged to. But he was more proud to belong to the empire of God's people. So it shows where his thoughts were going, if you like.
But it wasn't just down to James and the other Salvationists in the armed forces to minister to their comrades. Only days after the war started, Lieutenant Colonel Mary Murray, Secretary of the Salvation Army's Naval and Military League, was sent to Belgium and France to find out what the Salvation Army as a whole should be doing. In fact, she very nearly got trapped there. She was in Brussels just 3 days before it fell to the Germans, but managed to get out just in time. Amongst other things, Mary Murray recommended the provision of refreshment huts, like this one today, where soldiers could relax, read the papers, get cheap food, write letters home, and, if they wanted, attend a religious meeting. Wherever soldiers were, whether back home or at the front, there should be a Salvation Army centre. By the end of 1915, there were already 200 Salvation Army huts at army camps in Britain and France. But they needed people to staff them, people like Ada Lepedvin. Ada and her family were soldiers at St Sampson's Citadel in Guernsey, which is where I'm meeting her niece, Liz Walton.
They always just referred to it as the hall, and it was almost like a home from home because it was only about 100 yards down the road where the family lived. And they had a lot of social events here as well. It wasn't just for worship on Sundays. They were involved with young people's groups, with songsters. It was very much the centre of the family's life.
And of course it was here that Ada would have heard the speakers from London talking about the war effort.
They had all sorts of speakers here. It was a very active sort of centre, yes, and people did come over from the UK. And at that period, the main topic of conversation, presumably, and of discussion would have been the war, yes.
And then Ada saw this advertisement in the War Cry. Wanted 25 women Salvationists to assist in our refreshment and recreation huts with the troops in France.
That was what she must have replied to, because shortly after that she applied for her first passport and she was on her way. She went up to London to the Salvation Army headquarters and they gave her a permit, which is another document here, which is very fragile, isn't it? A worker's permit, yes, with the photograph of her in her bonnet. It sets out the rules and regulations for war workers and told her where to report on arrival. It was actually in Abbeville there for temporary duty.
So tell us a little bit about her work, when she got there, what she was involved in doing.
Well, she was doing what they just referred to as camp work. And this involved working in the Salvation Army huts. That's the one at Osterhoven, just above Boulogne. Wooden huts that were put up as rest huts for the troops doing their stints between going into the trenches. They provided food for them, they would write letters home, stitch back buttons onto uniform. The idea was that it was ordinary working class women doing the sort of things that sisters, mothers, what have you, would have done for the men had they been at home.
They also had an ambulance service as well, didn't they?
They did, and more than that, they actually had a motor ambulance band where the drivers were all bandsmen. Look on the back of that, it's actually Miss Ada, a present from the band. Here are a couple of the ambulances of the period. And again, messages on the back. Ada, with love in memory of many days spent in France, from Fred, 1917 to 1918.
But it was actually quite dangerous for Ada, wasn't it, at times?
Well, there were times when she was actually in the firing zone. There's a little note in one of her notebooks, very, very fragile now, but it says, August the 13th, slept in barn, Jerry over, dropped 5 around us, shrapnel through the roof. And then arrived 4:30 in the morning, shrapnel through roof again, slept under the table. It was just part of the job that they had to accept.
So they must have built up a very strong camaraderie.
They must have. I mean, they must have needed to support each other, yes. And it might be wartime, but they're still young people who make new friends and want to have a bit of a life while they're there, as well as working very hard.
And it wasn't just British Salvationists who were doing this sort of work. When the USA joined the war, Evangeline Booth, leader of the Salvation Army in the States, declared, "American boys are going to France. We must go with them." And that's what they did. They too built refreshment huts where they did their best to give soldiers a taste of good old home cooking. But on one occasion, supplies got a bit low, and it was a question of, well, what can you make when all you've got is sugar, flour, lard, baking powder, canned milk and cinnamon? The answer? Donuts. The soldiers loved them, and the women who cooked them became forever known as the Donut Girls. In Germany too, the Salvation Army was doing its best, despite all its work coming under government control. Officers who could be conscripted there became unofficial chaplains to their comrades, while those at home became involved in hospital visiting and passing on information about the missing and the wounded. On the Allied side, the longer the war went on, the harder it was to stick to the principle of neutrality. And in America, Australia and New Zealand, well, the Salvation Army didn't even pretend to be neutral.
This political neutrality thing was highly idealistic, but driven by a real fear in the heart of the general that his people in the Salvation Army would be caught up in war fever and their hearts would be filled with hatred for their fellow human beings, and he didn't want that. He allowed for patriotism, but was absolutely opposed to that drifting over into nationalism, a nationalistic fervour saying, my country's better than yours, and because you're German, you're awful. He just couldn't tolerate that. But it did mean that we went throughout the entire First World War without the office of the general ever pronouncing upon the ethical and moral issues involved. So you do get an impression that the overt lack of neutrality in the USA, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, was a far more natural, human, authentic response than the high-flown attempt at international headquarters to not go down that road. Who was right and who was wrong? I haven't got the faintest idea. I admire them all. It was just impossible. What do you do if you're the general of the Salvation Army and you want to hold your global family intact? You don't take sides. I understand that. But at the end of the day, is there not a way of the general not taking sides and still saying these things are wrong? That's the question.
Meanwhile, the war was destroying more and more lives on an almost unbelievable scale. In 1916, in the Battle of the Somme alone, more than 1 million men were killed or wounded. At the same time, James Finn was in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and winning the Victoria Cross, as the museum in Bodmin celebrates.
He was in the trenches in Mesopotamia at a place called Saniyat. He saw what was happening. They were wounded out in no man's land, and he got up and decided to go and rescue those guys that were wounded in no man's land.
And it was very difficult because he was under all this fire, wasn't he?
He was always under fire for the whole time, which he didn't sort of bother too much about. He went out and got some wounded guys back. He came and got a stretcher, and with another man he went off and tried to get some more wounded in. And he was under fire, as I say, all of that time.
Now, John, I got something to show you, which I don't think you've seen before,
okay.
Which is a cigarette card
wow.
of James Finn with his VC. I always find this a bit ironic because James would have forsworn tobacco, wouldn't he, when he was a Salvationist?
Yeah, it's quite ironic that there he is on the back of a cigarette card, or a tobacco card, if you like. But I've got something which is even more special. This is his actual Victoria Cross. It's not seen very often. Normally it's in the bank vault under the care of the Bodmin Town Council. He never saw this. The cigarette card is wrong. He would have never have worn that on his uniform because he was killed in March 1917 during the advance and occupation of Baghdad. He died aged 23.
But at last, in November 1918, the war ended for everyone and troops began to be demobbed and to go home. But Ada Lepedvin didn't join them. She stayed on in France until 1922 as part of the Salvation Army's War Graves Visitation Service.
There were two main duties. One was going back to England to pick up parties of relatives who wanted to come and visit the graves, and the Salvation Army offered this as a service to people of all religions or none. They would escort them over to France and Flanders, put them up in what they called hostels of consolation, and take them out to visit the graves of their relatives. The very primitive graves as they were then, they still just had a wooden cross and some were marked out with stones, but they were nothing like the war grave cemeteries that we see now.
And but there were many relatives who actually physically couldn't go, could they?
No, they couldn't, and that was the other part of the service. The Salvation Army girls worked in pairs. They had a camera, which is why we have all these photographs. They would take some flowers out, put them on the grave, and take a photograph of the flowers, the headstone. They would pick a few flowers and press them, and then put them in a card with the photograph and send that back to the relatives.
The death toll from the First World War was horrific. 17 million people were killed, 10 million soldiers and 7 million civilians. Among them were thousands of Salvationists whose names are included on war memorials in North America and the Caribbean, in India and Africa, in Australia and New Zealand, and all over Europe. This is a German war cemetery in France. 23,000 men are buried here, included among them German Salvationists.
Numbers were decimated in some of the fighting countries, but the heart of Salvationism remained intact. The general's idealistic approach did pay off in the end, and those countries at war with Great Britain and her allies still felt they belonged to the Salvation Army because they realized that we were committed to a cause higher than any political cause could ever be, the cause of serving Jesus Christ, the Saviour of the world. We lost facilities, finances were ravaged, we lost people, beautiful people, gifted people, All of those things happened. But I think spiritually we came through strong.